We're about to get into an aviation story that, honestly, it just defies belief. It's a classic tale of how a bunch of small, almost unnoticeable mistakes can snowball into a 200-ton jetliner becoming a completely silent glider over the middle of the dark Atlantic Ocean. This is the incredible story of Flight 236. Just picture it for a second. You're on an overnight flight, thousands of feet up, hours from land, and then, all of a sudden, the constant roar of the engines just stops. The lights flicker and die. You're left in total darkness and this heavy, weird silence inside a massive metal tube that's now just falling out of the sky. Well, that was the terrifying reality for 306 people on Air Transat Flight 236. So, how exactly did a routine flight turn into a powerless glider? Well, it all kicked off with a silence that was anything but peaceful. You know that constant hum on a plane? That's the sound of power, of everything working like it's supposed to. When both engines on Flight 236 flamed out, that sound was gone. It was replaced by a quiet so deep it was deafening. Passengers and crew were in near total darkness, hearing nothing but the sound of wind screaming past the fuselage as the plane started its long, unpowered descent toward the ocean. And this number right here, this is what makes the story so insane. When that second engine quit, the plane was 144 kilometers, that's about 90 miles, from the closest piece of land. And that land was a tiny little military airbase on an island. By every textbook, by every calculation, that was an impossible distance to glide. Just no way. So how in the world does this happen to a modern airplane? This wasn't one big dramatic explosion or failure. Nope. It was a chain of small, almost boring mistakes that just happened to line up perfectly to create this absolute nightmare scenario. And to figure out how, we have to go back 9 days before the flight even took off. It all began right there in the maintenance hangar. A routine check found a pretty serious problem, which then led to a really, really bad shortcut. So check out this timeline. It all starts on August 15th. Mechanics find little metal chips in the right engine's oil, which is a huge red flag. They decide to replace the whole engine, but the spare they got from Rolls-Royce, it was a slightly different, older model. This created a problem where some parts just didn't fit right, and under a tight deadline, the mechanics decided to, well, improvise. That one decision started the whole catastrophic chain reaction. Okay, so here's the nitty-gritty of the problem. The mechanics used a fuel tube from one engine model and a hydraulic tube from another. As you can imagine, these parts were never, ever designed to be put together. There wasn't enough space between them, putting two very high-pressure lines way too close to each other. So now, with every single flight, the engine's vibrations were causing these two mismatched tubes to rub and grind against one another. It was a subtle thing, totally invisible from the outside, but it was slowly, flight by flight, wearing a hole right through the fuel line. The mechanics had, without knowing it, installed a ticking time bomb deep inside the engine. Now, a mechanical problem is one thing, but let's head up to the cockpit because that's where a critical human error took this leak and turned it into a full-blown catastrophe. About 4 hours into the flight, the pilots get their first hint that something's wrong. A warning light pops up, fuel imbalance. It's telling them the fuel in the right wing tank is way lower than the left. That ticking time bomb had finally ruptured. The plane was now gushing fuel out into the night sky. The problem was, the pilots didn't know that. And what they did next, this was the mistake that sealed their fate. Instead of pulling out the checklist for this specific warning, they just went from memory. Now, standard procedure for a simple imbalance is to open something called a cross-feed valve. It lets fuel flow from the full tank over to the emptier one to balance things out. But if you have a fuel leak, that is the absolute worst thing you can possibly do. This quote just says it all, doesn't it? By trying to fix what they thought was a simple problem, they had just fed all of their good remaining fuel directly into the leak. They were now actively pumping the entire plane's fuel supply out into the Atlantic Ocean. And that is when this story enters its most dramatic phase, a desperate, silent, powerless glide for survival. At 6:13 in the morning, the right engine, completely starved of fuel, flames out. For 13 terrifying minutes, the plane is flying on just one engine. But that engine was being fed from the same leaking system. Sure enough, at 6:26 a.m., it went silent too. The giant Airbus was now officially a glider. The second all power was lost, this incredible piece of emergency gear automatically deployed, the RAT air turbine, or the RAT. It's basically a little propeller that drops out of the belly of the plane. The wind from the plane falling through the sky spins it, and that generates just enough emergency electricity to power the most critical flight instruments. It was their only lifeline. For an unbelievable 19 minutes, Captain Robert Piché and his first officer wrestled with this 200-ton glider, making these huge, sweeping S-turns to try and slow their descent and stretch the glide as far as they possibly could. To this day, it is the world record for the longest powerless glide of a commercial jetliner in history. Back in the cabin, it was pure chaos and terror. The flight attendants, believing there was no way they'd make it to land, were preparing passengers for a ditching in the Atlantic. People were writing notes, praying, holding hands with strangers, completely convinced they were about to crash into the cold, dark ocean below. But this story does not end in the water. It ends with one of the most spectacular landings you can imagine, and some really important lessons learned. Against every single odd, Captain Piché somehow managed to guide that silent jet perfectly to the runway at Legis Air Base. He had exactly one shot at this. With no engines, there's no such thing as a go-around. He brought the plane down hard, really hard, but he brought it down on solid ground. And the outcome? It's just astonishing. I mean, look at this. They landed so fast with no engine thrust to help slow them down that they blew out 8 tires on the runway. But not a single person was lost. The few serious injuries happened during the chaotic evacuation on the tarmac. It was, for all intents and purposes, a miracle. So why did it happen? Well, in aviation safety, they talk about something called the Swiss cheese model. Just imagine a bunch of slices of Swiss cheese lined up. Each slice is a layer of safety, and the holes are just random weaknesses. Usually, the solid part of one slice covers the hole in the next. But on this flight, the holes all lined up perfectly. A maintenance mistake, an ignored manual, a missing warning system on the plane itself, and finally, a critical pilot error. Every single layer of safety failed at the exact same time. After it was all over, Air Transat was hit with the largest fine in Canadian aviation history. But more importantly, things changed. Procedures were completely overhauled, and Airbus was required to create a software update for its planes that would automatically alert pilots to a possible fuel leak, making sure this exact chain of events could never, ever happen again. This whole incredible story really leaves you with a final thought. Yeah, it shows a shocking series of failures, but it also shows the amazing skill of the pilots and the backup systems that gave them a chance. It kind of makes you wonder, right? For every one of these accidents we hear about, how many invisible errors, how many near misses are being caught and corrected by those layers of safety that protect us every single time we fly?